We are getting ready to go live with Laura of Essential Pelvic Health. Let's invite her. All right. Just give you guys a couple of seconds to join, and then we'll also give Laura a couple minutes to come on here as well to join our stream. We're going to be talking about pelvic health, kind of 101 basics of pelvic health, talking about pelvic floor, the ins and outs, no pun intended, of your pelvic floor, and how you can best take care of the pelvic floor at all times in your life. All right, let's do this. Okay, let's see if we can get Laura on here. There we go. We did it.
Hi. How's it going? You hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Awesome.
Right.
Actually, I'm guessing I should probably put Do Not Disturb on. What do we think?
Probably. I don't normally get text messages at this time, but yeah, okay.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, awesome. So we're gonna record this. So even if people are not on, live, we can always post after. We're gonna talk a little bit about the pelvic floor, pelvic health, what it is that you do as an OT, occupational therapist that specializes in working with pelvic floor. And then hopefully we'll answer some questions if there are any questions. But in the next few weeks, we will have the opportunity to talk more specifics about the pelvic floor and how it relates to pregnancy, post-pregnancy, exercise, bladder health, constipation, lots of different really great topics that people have asked us about and that, are topics that you've blogged about and have lots of great information. So it's 7:02. So let's get started. We want to keep this fairly concise so people don't go totally
Yeah, we'll keep it short and sweet because, like you said, we're going to be doing lots of different topics. So I think, tonight's just a good launching pad to get some kind of basic understanding. There's a lot of kind of words and things out there about pelvic floor and Kegels people are familiar with. And I think tonight's a great way to just, as an occupational therapist, I work to make people functional. And that's why this, pelvic health is so just blends so well with it because the pelvic floor is so dynamic. It has its hands in so many different roles in our daily functions in life. And just to be able to better understand that, then you can start to just see how it fits into your life and where it kind of comes up and being able to not only fix problems if they come up, but prevent them, but also be able to start to understand your body so you can use it to make you stronger and to make you better. Yeah.
So I think probably a good place to start is to talk about what the pelvic floor is, because I use the pelvic floor, we used to have a floor, we use it kind of on a regular basis, and maybe people don't necessarily know what that encompasses. So could you tell us kind of about that a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. So forgive me because I'm missing some magnets. So if I drop my pelvic floor on the floor, that may happen because you can see here I've got a little chip because it's fallen so many times. But if you look at, let me scoot you back a little bit. If you look at the pelvis, the bony structure of the pelvis is like a ring, okay? So I've got some organs in here. I'm going to tip it so they don't fall out. So we've got this big kind of circular ring, okay? And when you look up at the bottom, the cap of that big open ring is your pelvic floor, okay? So your pelvic floor muscles, with all its different jobs, we've got these superficial muscles here. Okay, and this is the vaginal opening in the urethra. If you have one, males still have the pelvic floor muscles, they just don't have this hole here. And so these muscles, for the superficial ones, are kind of our open close muscles. They maintain continence, so when we don't want to be leaking, they maintain that, and then they also need to function in order to be able to void, to be able to urinate or have a bowel movement effectively when we want to. We need to have good coordination to shorten as well as lengthen, and that's going to be the kind of key like point that I want people to take away with tonight, is that the pelvic floor muscle works in two different directions. We are so familiar with the Kegel. Mr. Kegel came out and identified the pelvic floor, and we learned a lot about it, but then it was kind of just one dimensional understanding of it. And now we know so much more about it, that the pelvic floor muscles, not only do they lift and squeeze, but they also need to lengthen, and we need to be able to have coordination to go in both directions.
Right.
So we have these kind of, I call them front muscles, these more superficial muscles. And then if I take that layer away, we have our deeper pelvic floor muscles. So you can see that they are like this hammock underneath. We've got all these organs. We've got our bladder right behind the pubic bone.
Yep.
We have our uterus, if you have one, and we have our rectum in the back. So these organs are kind of lined up nice and neat sometimes in the midline inside this pelvic bowl. And underneath them is that kind of hammock of the deeper posterior pelvic floor muscles. Okay, so these muscles help support those pelvic organs. Okay, so you can start to understand that if we've got some disruption in our connective tissue, whether it's from delivering a baby or even just carrying a baby, you don't have to deliver a baby through the vaginal opening to have some disruption in the connective tissue in this space, but also just any sort of like repetitive downward pressure, like chronic constipation, if you're constantly having to strain to have a bowel movement, or if you just have a bad understanding, which I did, of not pushing your pee out. So being able to lengthen your pelvic floor muscles to urinate versus using your abdominal pressure to push it out fast. Any sort of downward pressure like that can disrupt the connective tissue to the organs, and then disrupt the function of the pelvic floor muscles, because now they have more of a demand on them. So we've got the front muscles and the back muscles. And then we have, if we look at the bony landmarks that the pelvic floor connects to, we've got the pubic bone, this broad bone right in the front. And then in the back, we have our tailbone and sacrum. So it kind of wraps from front to back. And then either side, we have our sit bones. Okay, so if you look, I can do this without dropping it. If you look, we have this nice diamond shaped space here. Okay, so the pelvic floor muscles are kind of connecting through this diamond shape at the base of our pelvis, and they don't move these muscles. These muscles aren't going to move when they contract, but it creates tension, which creates stability. So when we move, the pelvic floor muscles help stabilize us, and it's the foundation of our core. Okay, so it's the very base of our core. At the top of our core is our respiratory diaphragm, and then we have our deeper abdominal muscles and deeper back stabilizing muscles. Okay, so that's kind of just a real quick picture of the different roles and how they start to connect a little bit higher. So I do a lot of work with the rib cage and with the respiratory diaphragm and the abdominal wall and the hips, because that's all just kind of interconnected in that space.
Mm-hmm.
And the pelvic floor plays a role in it. It's not, if you think about doing Kegels, you're just isolating one muscle group, but it's really it's a key component and just a greater picture.
So then when you're like function, so day-to-day function, when would you sort of be recruiting your pelvic floor probably like the most?
So in your day-to-day functions, if you're not doing something that's demanding, if you're not doing a workout, if you're not lifting something heavy, your pelvic floor muscles should be playing a role in in the overall system. When we start to get into a little bit of dysfunction is if we start to over recruit the pelvic floor muscles and start to use them more than we really need them. So we start to get tight dysfunctional muscles. And that's where that, the big piece of the puzzle is to find out if you are starting to see some of these symptoms, which may look like some urinary leakage. It may look like constipation. It may look like you may not be having leakage, but maybe you're going to the bathroom all the time, or you have a really strong urge when you do have an urge and you don't always feel like you have a lot of time to get there, or you're going often. You get these urges every 30 minutes. So those are all kind of symptoms of potentially having some dysfunctional pelvic floor muscles that may be overactive. So if we're constantly doing Kegels, or if we're constantly doing an exercise program that's cueing us to lift up and engage and lift up constantly, we may not be allowing the muscles to lengthen and get their rest time. So then they may just be on all the time and they don't know how to turn off. So
So
it's always
the answer.
what's that?
The Kegel's not always the answer.
It is not always the answer. It can be sometimes the answer. And you also have to make sure that you're doing it properly. So that's a great question. I would love to hear in the comments from you guys, how many people are familiar with Kegels? How many people feel confident that they can do an effective Kegel or a proper Kegel? And then how many people are familiar with the reverse Kegel? So I'll explain it a little bit more, but I just want to get a good sense of how many people have actually heard of that and know how to lengthen their pelvic floor rather than just always tighten and lift.
I definitely think that's it's almost like the word that's used a lot by, really anyone in exercise who works with women primarily, usually like something that's like Pilates based or yoga based. And then also people who are in also like women's health. So like OBGYNs and sometimes midwives are saying like, oh, we'll just do like 100 Kegels every day and then you'll get our function back. So constantly pulling up and up and in and up and like, I think I'm doing it. Am I doing it? I don't know if I'm doing it. I have no idea if I'm doing it. Right. So like, it feels like this, that's not like a thing. I think probably from my clients I've heard the most like, oh, I was just told to like Kegel and it would be back to normal soon. I'm like, well, how do you know you're doing it right? And they're like, well, what do you mean? Well, yeah, okay. So that's a couple people that are funny. So they're saying they never heard of reverse Kegel.
Yeah. So, all right, let me back this up so I like to do things visually. So if you think about your pelvic floor muscles, okay, at the bottom of the pelvis, when we do a Kegel, we're thinking about closing and lifting and drawing up of those muscles, okay? And then we let go of that and it goes down to rest, okay? So we have like a resting tone to our pelvic floor muscles. It's never off because it has a lot of jobs to do. It's got to maintain continence, it's got to help stability, it's got to support the organs, but it shouldn't be on all the time. Like if, the shoulders are the easiest way. It should be like a low resting tone, shouldn't be up here, okay? It's up here, that's when we got to work on getting it down to the resting tone. From the resting tone, a nice low level resting tone, then we can lengthen our pelvic floor muscles. So it's taking the pelvic floor muscles from rest and lengthening them down and out, okay? When we urinate, as long as we're not pushing the pee out with our abdominal pressure, as long as we don't push it out, we are lengthening our pelvic floor, and that takes the pressure off the urethra so the urine can flow through. We just don't always associate that with anything, right? We don't know. It's like we do something like we pee, but we don't know what we're actually doing. But that's kind of the connection. As long as you're not pushing, that's how you start to build that. And the key thing with that is to make sure that you're not bearing down. So if you push and like bear down with your belly, then you're just using your abdominal pressure to get that to lengthen. This is an active lengthening, just like it's active to squeeze and lift for the Kegel, it's an active lengthening. When we breathe, the easiest way to connect with the pelvic floor is through our breath because it moves with our diaphragm, with our breath. Okay. So if you want to think about, I don't knock over my my skinny bones. When you when you inhale, your respiratory diaphragm sits underneath your rib cage here. Okay. When you inhale, it compresses down. It's kind of drawing the oxygen to the lungs. So your diaphragm compresses down. In order to accommodate for this downward pressure on our abdominal contents, our pelvic floor lengthens to receive that downward pressure. Our abdominal wall lengthens and expands outwards to receive that. So we get this kind of, we inhale and we get this lengthening and expanding out direction, okay? Then when we exhale, it comes back in. So Julie Weave does a nice job of explaining how the diaphragm and the pelvic floor work together like a piston. We inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. And it's not that we necessarily feel that full motion that's happening when we breathe, but that's what's happening. And so if you want to think about like tapping into that, when you inhale, you want to think about filling this balloon. So the belly is going to expand out in like a three-dimensional, a 360 degrees ring. We're going to inhale out, and the pelvic floor is the bottom of that balloon that's going to expand down and open. Okay, so you can
opposite of that. Do you find that when that sometimes women inhale and everything will go up, and then when they
Yep.
exhale, yeah.
Yes, and that's very common. You'll see that's like a shallow breathing pattern. You'll see the chest rise and the shoulders rise, and the stomach will actually come in. Okay, so when that happens, our diaphragm never gets to compress down, and it never gets to draw the oxygen into the lungs. So we get this kind of short inhale. So we're only feeling kind of like the tip of the lungs, and then the whole core system just gets jammed up there. So like if someone does do a high chest breathing pattern, the first training is to get it down into the belly and really feel that belly expand on the inhale, and then just feel everything float back in. You don't need to contract it yet. When we start to work on the core bracing and engagement, then that's going to be on the exhale, because that's naturally what's happening when they're coming back in.
Right.
But yeah, and then once you can get the breath down to the belly, then you want to really refine it and get it wide into the ribs. Okay, if we get a nice wide inhale and back into the back space, that's going to really get a nice range of motion for that diaphragm, get a nice range of motion for the pelvic floor, and then it's really going to be able to give you a great dynamic engagement for core strength.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions here that I think are great questions. Well, someone commented, said, sounds like a chronic problem with people that live with high anxiety. So people who live here in their kind of shallow breath and they're not utilizing their diaphragm. And that's very true, because it also, when you diaphragmatically breathe, it stimulates the vagus nerve, which basically is like it's your parasympathetic nervous system, which is your rest and digest. So if you're up here constantly and you're not really utilizing the diaphragm and you're not able to get in as much oxygen, you do live in like this high anxiety, like, why am I like always like so, shoulders are always so tight, and like I see it all the time with women, especially who are in high stress jobs or high stress situations at home. They tend to get very, very shallow with their breathing, and it's like a game changer to like turn that off and try to like really get into the diaphragm.
Yeah, so just like you said, the vagus nerve comes down along this space, comes through the diaphragm into all the organs and also into the pelvic floor. And that so anxiety, stress, trauma, all these are just big, major components of the pelvic floor. Our pelvic floor will tighten up and respond to this, as well as our autonomic nervous system will ramp up, especially that like, if we've got that like type A go person has a really hard time to transition and bring it down. You could really struggle with these concepts. So bringing it to the breath and using that as a tool, and then that just even having that as a tool for your stress and anxiety and breathing will then just overflow in all the other functions.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another question underneath that said, should you belly breathe all the time?
No. So one, belly breathing is almost like, so I like to teach people how to belly breathe if they're way up here. Get it down, get the breath down into the belly, but then quickly get it into the ribs. Okay. So belly breathing is almost like we're just kind of letting this great movement escape forward. And we really want to try to get it into the ribs because we've got the diaphragm, we've got the thoracic spine, and we've got all kinds of great stuff in here. And if we can get this good side expansion and back expansion, it's just gonna help all other functions. So
It's like it's more like a conscious like expansion of your belly and your back and your sides. And then when you actually try to move it up into the rib cage, it feels more like a natural breath, like something.
Uh, no, it just that I would say that that's where I like to have people spend some focus on to if you can get a really good lateral expansion and back expansion in your breath, your diaphragm is you're just going to be able to get all that range of motion with the diaphragm, which is going to overflow into the pelvic floor and just overflow into better core engagement. Okay.
Right.
But either way, belly breath or rib expansion or what part we're focusing on, it's not how you're going to breathe all throughout your day. Okay, so you won't be able to sustain that. It'll be a lot of work because it actually is a lot of work to really start to connect with this and really feel big range of motion. So it's great to do for an exercise. It's great to do to just repattern. So when you are just normally breathing, you are starting to carry over and it just naturally happens in that space. But yeah, you can't, you're not going to be able to like do your work or do your workout with huge, full, expansive breaths the whole time, but certainly using it. Like if you're going to go and do like a heavy lift, or if you're going to be, you're going to be, picking up the kid, certainly doing a nice big inhale and engaging the core may be a good strategy for you.
That'll be great to talk about, like when we get into our talking about pelvic floor and exercise. That's definitely a big strategy of heavy lifts. So when you lift heavy, it is a strategy to take a nice deep breath in. And I'm excited to talk about that a little bit because we'll use that when we Olympic lift. But you have to know how to do it properly in order to brace and not bear down and push down and pause that way.
Yes, we don't need any badges of honor peeing on the floor because we lifted really heavy. I still want you guys to lift really heavy and do what excites you and what makes you happy, but let's do it responsibly because there's all different types of bracing techniques. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yep, just starting to motor plan that and sync everything together.
Right. We have another question here that says, do you find that there's a strong correlation to UTI? I assume that means when they're hold a lot of tension in pelvic floor and are like shallow breathing and they're not utilizing the diaphragm. Do you find that there's a correlation with recurrent UTIs?
Yes, absolutely. So whether it's recurrent UTIs or it's more recurrent UTI-like symptoms. So tight pelvic floor muscles can feel like UTI symptoms. You can have that burning, you can have that urgency, you can have that pain, just because the pelvic floor muscles and the tissues are tight. So it doesn't always necessarily, a lot of times people, and I've been there too, like you'll be convinced that it's a UTI, results come back negative or nothing that significant, but the antibiotics make you feel better, so it must have been a UTI. But really the antibiotics often kind of mask what just might be muscle tension because it kind of gives you that relief. It has a little bit of like I think it's like an anti-inflammatory property that may make that feel better. But yeah, a lot of times it could just be, balancing out the tissue and the muscles in the system to get rid of those symptoms, that the UTI-like symptoms.
Yeah, that's so fascinating that can be connected muscular too. a UTI. It's crazy.
Yeah, and it feels so, especially these front muscles, these more superficial muscles, they're smaller. So they're smaller, thinner muscles. So when they're tight and you stretch them, it feels very noxious. It's not like a larger muscle if you tight and stretch it and it's got like a trigger point. It doesn't have that like just meaty muscle pain. It feels like a fingernail, or it feels like a tearing or like a sandpaper. Like it has a more noxious like sensation associated with, because like I'll show people, I'm like, I'm just using my finger and it's this flat part and I'm not poking you with anything, but it really feels like that, just because the stretch of a smaller muscle can feel like that. So yeah, the sensations are a little bit different there.
That's crazy. I can't even like, I didn't, that's crazy. Around my head. I have to think about that one. We had another comment. I had what I once thought was low back pain, and once I got my pelvic floor relaxed and my pelvis in alignment, the pain went away. Do you see that a lot, like pelvic floor tension and back pain, lower back pain?
Yes, absolutely. So if you just look at the setup, so the pelvic floor muscles, now the pubic bone is facing down, and we've got the tailbone and the sacrum, that broad flat bone in the back. So you can see how these pelvic floor muscles come up and attach at the base of the spine. So whether or not, we'll get into a lot of how like posture affects the pelvic floor as well and the core. But you can see if these pelvic floor muscles are tight, it could pull on the spine. I don't have a flexible, but you can see how it could kind of pull in this lumbosacral area. Or if we've got dysfunction here, you could see how it could be pulling and creating tension on the pelvic floor muscles too. So posture, alignment, all those things will have a play, and the pelvic floor comes right up into that spine. So the
What
spine, the hip, a lot of hip dysfunctions will correlate with the pelvic floor as well.
what about people who tend to like clench their butt a lot? Because I know that, I mean, I'm like almost 7.5 months pregnant, and I find that more and more so as I get further along and I get bigger, I find that I'm like having to like squeeze my butt all day. Like, why am I doing this? But like, did you see that a lot? And like that, like women kind of trying to like clench their butt, and then that causes.
Yes, I do that. I'm a butt gripper. We're calling butt grippers. But yeah, well, I mean, specifically with pregnancy, we get into this kind of often, not always. People can vary for sure. But we can get into this kind of opened pelvic, we're creating space, we're getting to this open pelvic position. And a lot of times we get tucked under. I don't know if you guys can see me. We get tucked under and we're creating stability from the bottom of our pelvis now. Okay. And our ribs are getting kind of pushed up. Baby's pushing the diaphragm up and the ribs are kind of open. So we have this open ribs, open pelvis. And that's how we're hanging on. And our pelvic floor muscles are right in there. If we're gripping underneath, these are kind of where like underneath where the space is. So if we're gripping here, you can see that these pelvic floor muscles are all through there and they're working hard for you. So when you're pregnant, you kind of have to go with it a little bit. I mean, be mindful of trying to maintain best neutral pelvis and neutral rib cage, but I mean, baby takes priority and it's going to rearrange furniture all over the place. But it's important to know that postpartum, once you deliver and you've kind of burst that bubble of that suspension tension in that belly, and you've got this open pattern. So start trying to reconnect and draw, not aggressively, but just start to reestablish connection. And using your core or using your breath and your posture can really help start to bring that along slowly, not quickly.
Yeah,
But
our
yes, it's very common, butt grippers.
it's like that the number one thing that we do is talk about breathing first. When women are coming back to think about coming back to exercise, they're on 6 weeks postpartum and they're ready to like return to it. Well, we always address breathing first. I think breathing is probably about the first 30 minutes of the first class that we do, because we talk about, exactly what we're saying with like bringing the breath down low and then using the rib cage to control the breath and being able to like move the rib cage with your breath. And you know, it's amazing how much control you can gain and how much awareness of your core and your pelvic floor are connected that you can gain just simply through your breath postpartum because of how incredibly it had changed during pregnancy.
Yeah. And like the one big thing that I try to tell people when they're still pregnant, just fight for that downward. Like that diaphragm is jammed up there. You're not going to get a big motion, but fight for whatever you can.
Look, I think that that's another thing we do in our pregnancy classes. When you inhale, I kind of say like, okay, you can make yourself look like you're like a month further along by and then when you exhale, you kind of like gently pulling your baby in and giving your baby a little hug toward your spine. So that's like how we sort of say like, okay, you can see almost a little bit better when you're pregnant, when you're expanding and contracting in like a gentle way, not obviously not gripping, but yes, that's
Yeah.
another question here. I find a lot of cardio instructors will tell you to squeeze your butt to engage your core. Is that correct instruction?
Um, I'm trying to think where they're coming from. I don't think so. If you're thinking about the core, pelvic floor, respiratory diaphragm, deep transverse abdominals, and your back stabilizes your multifidi. Your glutes, if you're squeezing your butt, your glutes are accessory muscles. You want your glutes to come online and help support stabilizing the pelvis, but you don't want to be gripping and you don't want to be tucking. That's like the
Right.
number one, because you're changing the demand on the pelvic floor, and then you're also putting your spine at in a bad alignment.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think making sure that you're using your glutes when you're moving, when you're doing squats, when you're, you know, doing your functional day-to-day tasks, making sure that those glutes are coming online. Because if you're gripping and tucking under, you've taken the glutes out, and now you're using your hip rotators and other muscles. So I don't see where squeezing your butt muscles could help your core too much.
I hear a lot of over cueing from a lot of coaches and fitness instructors who will say to squeeze your abs when you're doing certain things. And for me, that just encourages like an over stimulation, over shortening of your abdominal muscles rather than
Mhm.
allowing them to function in the dynamic way that they were designed to function.
Yeah. So if you're, I mean, if you're gripping anything, it's not going to be very functional, because like even when we're running, we can't just grip our quads and they're going to do their job. They need to lengthen and shorten, just like the pelvic floor needs to move. We can't just kegel our way through a run. We need to allow it to move. Same with the abdominal wall. It needs to move with our breath. So if we're over gripping, and that's actually often where a lot of dysfunction comes from. If we're over gripping, say like we over grip with our obliques, our external obliques up here, we're kind of cinching our balloon in one spot, and we're pushing pressure above and below. We're redistributing the pressure that's in this abdominal canister. So one, this is going to be tight, and then it's going to start putting strain on other structures. So being able to use the whole system more evenly, and that's even when I'm teaching like core engagement, we want to be thinking about um, evenly drawing ribs and lower abs and sides in. And if we start to overuse one area, we see it pop out. We see like a pooch in one area. That's when you have to back off and start to just find that balance.
Yeah, like segment almost like one kind of group at a time so that they're all working. Because I feel like we can definitely, and you know, whether we're pregnant, postpartum, or have never had a baby, you can definitely over engage with certain muscles. I mean, really anywhere in your body, but definitely for sure, pelvic floor and core muscles. Some will become stronger than others for lots of different reasons. I was once told that I was like very rectus dominant. So the six
Mm-hmm.
pack the ones that took over right away. And I definitely don't doubt that that was true because I was a college sprinter. So like I was very driven by my rectus. So, but it's interesting to kind of be aware of like, even if you can do 1,000 crunches in a row and feel great the next day, can you get into a hollow position where you're actually really trying to get those deep stabilizing transverse muscles also involved in your core? So can you do that is another question, right? So it's not just about can you do all of these things with your abs. It's like, does your core support all the rest of the movements that your body is trying to undertake.
Yeah, that's a great point, because you've got many different muscle layers. So you have your rectus abdominals coming up down, those beauty six pack muscles. Then you have your obliques on the sides, external internal obliques. And then those are your mover muscles, because they're going from the ribs to the pelvis. When they shorten and contract, they move our rib cage in relationship to our pelvis. Okay. Below those muscles are our transverse abdominals, so deeper, and they traverse, they go side to side, and we've got kind of three levels. They go across the pelvis, the midsection, and then the rib cage. And these are the stabilizer muscles. They're not going to move my hip bones closer, but just like the pelvic floor, they create tension, which creates stability. So even going back to that butt gripping, instead of stabilizing underneath, let's stabilize the pelvis from the top and support the pelvic floor. If you're really, really like tense and strong in your rectus, then you're not going to be getting some good stabilizing engagement, because it's going to be kind of pulling forward, and we kind of look for those signals when that's happening, and start to spread the load. Like when you get into diastasis, you don't want to be rectus dominant. That's going to just pop through. You want to be able to get those transversal stabilizers engaged to be able to set you up. And especially if you get rectus, like you said, with sprinting, that's a very forward motion. If you start to do some rotational things, you're going to start to see some struggles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we had another comment. I think the misconception comes from when you hear engage your core, most of us probably grip rather than evenly contract all the muscles, which is
Yeah.
true. I mean, but that's also, I think, from my experience as a strength coach, that it's from people skipping steps when they're working out. So they jump into an exercise routine where, you know, they're told to engage their core. So they just go, okay, where's my abs? Okay, squeeze. And they haven't set the foundational work of understanding how the breath works, understanding how the diaphragm and pelvic floor are connected, and understanding how all of those muscles have to work together, and that your core is not just your six pack muscles. It's a whole canister, everything around. So it's definitely like you grip because you just don't know any better. Why would you know any better? Because no one told you.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yep. Breaking it down to build it up.
Yeah, exactly. So these are definitely things, exercise specific, pregnancy specific, postpartum specific, bladder, constipation, all these things we're going to address in the next few weeks.
Sex, hormones. I mean, it has such a big reach. So anything that comes to mind as you hear this, if light bulbs start going off, shoot them out to us. We want you guys to direct this conversation.
Yeah,
We want
absolutely.
to give you information that you're eager to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good opportunity to ask questions that you maybe were like, is this, something that like I don't know about this, and I'm maybe too embarrassed to ask it, or you didn't know who to ask. It's definitely like a great opportunity to do this, because we are going to do this over the next few weeks. I'm kind of down to my final countdown here, but I think I'll last. Okay. Ooh, just cut out there. Oh yeah, and yes, someone's asking about C-sections. We will absolutely talk about C-sections. That's a huge percentage of births and birth recoveries, especially nowadays. So we'll definitely talk about how C-section scarring affect your core and your pelvic floor for sure, because that's really, really important.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people think that, oh, well, if I didn't deliver vaginally, my pelvic floor should be perfect. And that's not the case. I mean, you went through the adaptations your body goes through, as well as, I mean, not only, I mean, you didn't deliver through the vaginal space, but you delivered through your abdominal wall. So there's just, scar management, and again, major reconnection to that whole core system, and breathing and reestablishing function.
Yeah, a lot of people are told like, oh, well, we don't cut through any muscles. Okay, well, tissue is what muscles. So you gotta cut through a lot of layers. If you've ever seen those, or even like I saw a simulation video, like a computer generated C-section. It was fascinating, and my third was a C-section, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm glad I didn't see this. But it's amazing how, and all of these, so all these connections are all of a sudden, interrupted with this like huge incision, and then you have so much healing to do. So, that's another piece of like kind of getting back into movement and giving yourself a little bit of grace when it comes to, returning to whatever your normal is. But yeah, what are we talking about next week, Laura? That's the question.
What do we want to? Do we want to dive into pregnancy? Do we want to dive into postnatal? Do we want to just
I
do
think
general fitness?
Yeah, I think we should do pregnancy first, and then we can, maybe that can go into postpartum. Maybe it will naturally go into postpartum, and then we can kind of talk about, I think that natural progression of talking about exercise and movement, and then we'll talk about the more specifics. I think that makes sense. So next week we'll talk
Yeah.
about pregnancy and then possibly some postpartum. So if you have questions that relate to any of those things, please send them to us, send them to me, send them to Laura, either of our pages. We also run the at pregnancy_fitness Instagram page. So, definitely you can send that there as well.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, Nora. That was great.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so excited for the coming weeks, and we'll have some fun.
Yeah, thanks for joining, guys. That was awesome.
We'll see you guys next week, 7 o'clock Monday.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.